The Hourglass Doll. England, 1980. The flyer arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between the pages of Understanding Grief, a guide for the bereaved, a book Edward Marlowe had never ordered, never requested, yet found waiting in his mailbox like a prescription he couldn't remember needing. The paper felt expensive between his fingers, cream-colored and heavy, with text printed in an elegant serif font that belonged to another century. Solace dolls, custom companions for the inconsolable, handcrafted with love, infused with memory when goodbye feels impossible. Let us help you say hello again. 3 years had passed since the accident. 3 years since the screech of brakes that came too late, since the funeral where he'd stood beside a small white coffin and felt his world collapse inward like a dying star. The house on Bramwell Street had become a mausoleum, Lucy's room preserved exactly as she'd left it, her books still stacked by the bed, her clothes still hanging in the wardrobe like ghosts waiting to be worn. Edward taught year 4 at St. Catherine's Primary, though he moved through his days like a man underwater, his voice echoing strangely in his own ears as he explained long division to children who reminded him always of what he'd lost. The other teachers spoke in careful, hushed tones around him. The children sensed his sadness the way animals sense storms. That evening, he sat in Lucy's room holding the flyer, surrounded by the terrible silence that had replaced her laughter. The wallpaper, pale yellow with dancing teddy bears, seemed to mock him. Her bed was still made, the coverlet pulled tight, waiting for a child who would never come home from school again. He almost threw the flyer away, should have thrown it away. Instead, 3 weeks later, he found himself at the post office, mailing a small package containing Lucy's favorite nightgown, the one with the unicorns. A lock of her auburn hair saved from her first proper haircut, and her most treasured book, The Secret Garden, spine cracked from countless readings. The reply came faster than expected, a single line, handwritten in fountain pen. Your companion will arrive within the fortnight. Payment has been received in full. Edward frowned. He'd sent no payment, had seen no price listed anywhere. The crate arrived on a gray November morning, delivered by a man in an old-fashioned postal uniform who seemed to materialize from the fog itself. Edward signed for it with shaking hands, then watched the delivery man disappear into the mist as if he'd never existed at all. The wooden box sat heavy in his arms, smelling of sawdust and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him of funeral flowers. Inside his kitchen, he pried off the lid with trembling fingers. She was perfect. The doll lay nestled in white silk, her porcelain face so lifelike it made his breath catch. Auburn hair, the exact shade of Lucy's, fell in careful ringlets around delicate shoulders. Her dress was white cotton with tiny blue flowers, not the nightgown he'd sent, but something new, something that looked exactly like the dress Lucy had worn on her last birthday. But it was the eyes that undid him, green as summer grass, with long lashes that seemed to flutter in the lamplight. Lucy's eyes, captured in ceramic and glass, staring up at him with an expression of patient waiting. Beside the doll lay an hourglass, its brass frame tarnished with age. The glass bulbs were filled with sand so dark it seemed to absorb light, and beneath that, a single sheet of yellowed paper with 7 lines of text. Rules for use. 1. Keep the doll inside the home where your loved one last lived. It cannot function elsewhere. 2. Never allow the doll outside its box for longer than 1 full turn of the hourglass. 3. Return it to the box before the final grain falls. No exceptions. 4. Do not speak its name after midnight. 5. If the doll begins speaking memories you don't recall, do not correct it. Listen, nod, return it to the box. 6. Do not introduce it to others. You may stop recognizing who is real. 7. Never, under any condition, flip the hourglass a second time in the same day. Edward's hands shook as he read the rules again. The logical part of his mind, the part that taught fractions and spelling tests, screamed that this was madness. Dolls didn't come to life. Death was final. This was nothing more than an elaborate, cruel joke. But the part of him that had died with Lucy whispered different words. What if? What if? What if? That evening he carried the box upstairs to Lucy's room, set it carefully on her bed, next to the stuffed rabbit that had been her favorite since birth. The hourglass went on the nightstand, its dark sand pooled at the bottom like a promise. He waited until the house felt properly dark, properly quiet. Then, with hands that trembled like autumn leaves, he flipped the hourglass. The sand began to fall. For a moment, nothing happened. The doll lay still in its silk nest, perfect and lifeless. Edward felt foolish, bitter, a grown man playing with toys, grasping at fantasies because reality had become unbearable. Then the doll's eyes fluttered open. "Daddy?" The voice was Lucy's exactly. Not similar, not reminiscent, but perfect in every inflection. Edward's heart stopped, restarted, hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. The doll sat up with movements that were almost human, almost natural, but carried just enough stiffness to remind him what she was. Her green eyes found his face and filled with joy, the same joy Lucy had always shown when he came home from work. "Daddy, I've been waiting for you." He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room felt warmer suddenly, filled with a presence he'd mourned for 3 long years. "I missed you," the doll continued, her voice carrying that slight lisp Lucy had never quite outgrown. "Will you read to me? Please? Like before?" Edward's vision blurred. He reached for the secret garden with hands that no longer felt like his own. For 1 perfect hour, she was alive. She giggled at the funny voices he made for the characters. She curled against his side exactly the way Lucy used to, warm and small and real. She asked him about his day at school, remembered the names of his students, worried that Mrs. Henderson in year 6 was still giving him trouble. When the last grains of sand fell through the hourglass, she looked up at him with wide, understanding eyes. "Time to sleep now, Daddy." She lay back in the box, folded her hands over her chest, and was still. Edward sat in the dark room for a long time after, listening to the silence that felt different now, not empty, but expectant. The next evening he flipped the hourglass again. And the next. And the next. The hour became the center of his universe, the pivot around which everything else revolved. He began leaving work early, calling in sick, letting his responsibilities slide away like sand through an hourglass. His sister Margaret called less frequently, then stopped calling altogether when their conversations became awkward and strained. "You sound different, Eddie," she'd said during their last conversation. "Distant. Are you taking care of yourself?" But Edward was taking care of himself, better than he had in years. Lucy was home again, and that was all that mattered. The doll, Lucy, knew things. She remembered their private jokes, their special games, the songs he used to sing her to sleep. She knew that he kept her favorite biscuits in the kitchen cupboard, that he'd saved all her drawings from school, that he still sometimes bought her favorite yogurt out of habit and let it spoil in the fridge. She was Lucy in every way that mattered. But as the weeks passed, small things began to feel wrong. The doll would speak of memories that seemed slightly off, a birthday party where the cake had been chocolate instead of vanilla, a trip to the seaside where it had rained instead of shone, a bedtime story about a princess who chose the dragon instead of the prince. Following the rules, Edward never corrected her. He listened. He nodded. He told himself that grief had confused his own memories, that she knew their shared history better than he did. The house began to change around them. Photos on the mantelpiece seemed different, sometimes showing moments he didn't remember, sometimes missing people he was sure had been there before. The mirror in Lucy's room started reflecting strangely, showing corners of the room that didn't match what Edward could see with his own eyes. And always, always, there were sounds when the doll was boxed. Footsteps in the hallway, a child's laughter echoing from empty rooms, the creak of floorboards under small feet. Edward told himself it was the house settling, the pipes cooling, the wind in the eaves. But part of him began to suspect that Lucy was still there even when the hour was over, playing games he couldn't see, exploring a house that existed in the spaces between seconds. The first time he let the sand run out, it was an accident. He'd been reading Alice in Wonderland aloud, not one of Lucy's usual favorites, but she'd requested it specifically that evening. The story had drawn him in, the familiar rhythm of the words soothing in a way that made him forget to watch the hourglass. When he looked up, the sand had stopped falling. The glass was empty. Lucy looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before, not quite human, not quite right. "Daddy," she said, and her voice carried an echo it hadn't had before. "Why did you let me die?" The words hit him like physical blows. The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows deeper. Lucy, sweetheart, you know it wasn't. You were supposed to pick me up from Sarah's house, but you stayed late at school instead. You let me walk home alone." Edward's mouth went dry. This wasn't how it had happened. Lucy had been with Margaret that day, had been crossing the street to buy sweets when the car ran the red light. But as he tried to hold on to the real memory, it felt slippery, uncertain. "I waited for you," the doll continued, her green eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. "I waited and waited, but you never came, so I decided to walk. That's when the car—" "No," Edward whispered, but the word felt hollow. Had he been supposed to pick her up? The memory felt so real suddenly, so vivid. He could almost see Lucy standing outside Sarah's house, checking her little watch, wondering where Daddy was. "It's all right," the doll said, reaching out to pat his hand with fingers that felt warmer than porcelain should. "I forgive you, but promise you'll never leave me waiting again." Edward stared at her perfect face, at eyes that held knowledge no 8-year-old should possess. The rules said to return her to the box immediately if she spoke of memories he didn't recall. But this memory felt real now, true in a way that made his chest ache with fresh guilt. He should have put her back in the box, should have followed the rules. Instead, he pulled her onto his lap and held her until dawn. After that night, everything changed. The hours stretched longer, seemed to last for days sometimes. The doll, Lucy, spoke of more and more memories that Edward was sure had never happened, but which felt increasingly real as she told them. Birthday parties he'd missed because of work. School plays where she'd looked for him in the audience and found an empty seat. Bedtime stories he'd promised to read but never had time for. Each false memory carried the weight of genuine guilt, and Edward found himself apologizing over and over for failures he was no longer sure hadn't happened. Lucy forgave him every time, her small hand patting his cheek, her voice gentle and understanding. "It's all right, Daddy. You're here now. That's what matters." The house around them began to feel unstable, reality shifting like sand in an hourglass. Edward would find doors open that he was certain he'd closed, find lights on in rooms he hadn't entered. The phone rang constantly, but when he answered, there was only silence on the other end. His reflection in mirrors became unreliable. Sometimes he looked older than he remembered, sometimes younger. Sometimes there were people standing behind him who weren't there when he turned around. Margaret appeared on his doorstep one gray afternoon, her face tight with worry. "Eddie, we need to talk. You haven't been answering your phone. Your school called me. They say you haven't been in for 2 weeks. Had it been 2 weeks? Time had become fluid, meaningless. The only time that mattered was the hour with Lucy, the perfect 60 minutes when the world made sense again. "I'm fine, Margaret. Better than fine, actually." She pushed past him into the hallway, her eyes taking in the dust motes dancing in afternoon light, the stack of unopened mail by the door, the strange quality of silence that filled the house. "This isn't healthy, Eddie. You're grieving, I understand that, but—" "Lucy's upstairs," he said quietly. "Would you like to meet her?" Margaret's face went white. "Eddie, Lucy is dead. She died 3 years ago. You know this." But Edward was no longer certain he did know this. The memories felt confused, overlapping. There was Lucy in the car accident, yes, but there was also Lucy upstairs in her room, waiting for him to come read her a story. Both things felt equally true, equally real. "Come and see," he said, taking Margaret's hand. "She's been asking about you. She remembers the last time you visited, when you brought her that stuffed elephant." Margaret pulled away from him, backing toward the door. "I never brought her a stuffed elephant, Eddie, and my last visit was for her funeral." After Margaret left, Edward sat in Lucy's room and thought about truth, about memory, about the malleability of both. The doll lay in its box, waiting for evening, for the turn of the hourglass that would bring her back to him. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, like tears. That night he flipped the hourglass twice. The second hour was different. Lucy emerged from the box as always, but this time she wasn't alone. Another figure materialized in the corner of the room, tall, shadowy, wearing a dress that might once have been white but now looked gray as ash. "Who's that?" Edward asked, though part of him already knew. "That's Mummy," Lucy said cheerfully, as if having a dead woman in the corner was the most natural thing in the world. "She's been waiting to see you." The figure stepped forward, and Edward saw Sarah's face, but wrong, distorted, like a photograph left too long in water. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her eyes dark hollows that reflected nothing. "Hello, Edward," she said, and her voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. "I've been so lonely." This wasn't right. Sarah had died 5 years before Lucy, cancer taking her slowly over months of hospitals and false hopes. But here she was, or something wearing her shape, standing in their daughter's room like she belonged there. "I don't understand," Edward whispered. "The hourglass," Lucy explained patiently. "When you turn it twice, it opens doors. Mummy can visit now, can't you, Mummy?" Sarah nodded, her neck moving in a way that suggested broken bones. "We can be a family again, Edward. Just like before. Just like it should have been." Edward stared at his dead wife, at his dead daughter, and felt reality fracture around him like safety glass. The room seemed larger now, filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. In the corners he could see other figures forming, indistinct shapes that might have been people he'd known, people he'd lost, people who'd never existed at all. "This isn't real," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What's real?" Lucy asked, tilting her head in that way she used to when puzzling over difficult questions. "Are your memories real? Are the people who tell you we're dead real? Or are we real, right here, right now?" The hourglass on the nightstand had stopped working entirely. Sand hung suspended in the glass like stars frozen in space. Time had become negotiable, optional. Edward reached out to touch Sarah's face, and his hand passed through her like she was made of morning mist. "Not yet," she said sadly, "but soon. When you stop believing in the other world, we'll be solid again. We'll be real again." Days passed, or perhaps years. Edward had stopped trying to measure time in any meaningful way. The house existed now in a state of perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something in between. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't need to. Lucy and Sarah were with him constantly now, along with others, his parents, grandparents, childhood friends, people whose names he'd forgotten but whose faces felt familiar. The living world became increasingly unreal. When Margaret came again, she looked translucent, ghostly. Her voice sounded far away, as if she were speaking to him through water. "Eddie, please. You need help. You need to come with me." But Edward couldn't understand why she seemed so upset. He was happy now, happier than he'd been since before Sarah got sick. His family was complete again, perfect again. Why would he leave? "Lucy died, Eddie, 3 years ago, in a car accident. Do you remember?" But that seemed like something from a dream now, a nightmare that had felt real upon waking but faded in the light of day. Lucy was here, chattering about her day at school, showing him drawings she'd made, asking him to read her favorite stories. How could she be dead when she was so obviously alive? Margaret left crying, but Edward barely noticed. He was too busy helping Lucy with her homework, listening to Sarah hum while she folded laundry that never seemed to stay folded. The mirror in the hallway stopped showing his reflection entirely. Instead, it showed the house as it used to be, bright, warm, filled with laughter and life. Sometimes Edward would catch glimpses of himself in that other house, younger, happier, surrounded by his family. That was the real house, he realized. This was the real life. Everything else had been the dream. The hourglass shattered on a Tuesday. Edward found it on Lucy's floor, brass twisted, glass scattered like fallen stars. The black sand had spilled across the carpet, and where it touched, the floor seemed to ripple like water. "It's all right, Daddy," Lucy said, sweeping up the sand with her small hands. "We don't need it anymore. Time doesn't matter here." And she was right. Without the hourglass to mark the hours, Edward lost all sense of when one day ended and another began. He existed in an eternal present where Lucy was always 8 years old, where Sarah was always young and healthy, where loss was something that happened to other people in other lives. Sometimes he would find notes pushed under his door, bills, warnings, concerned messages from people whose names felt familiar but whose faces he could no longer picture clearly. He would read them with mild curiosity, like looking at postcards from a foreign country he'd never visited. The phone stopped ringing, the mail stopped coming. The world outside his windows became gray and formless, like looking through frosted glass. But inside the house, everything was perfect. Lucy grew no older but seemed to accumulate memories, stories of days Edward couldn't quite recall but which felt real when she told them. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer holidays by the sea. A whole lifetime of moments that might have been, should have been, now were. Sarah spoke of the books she would have written if she'd lived, the places they would have traveled, the conversations they would have had. Her words painted pictures of a future that felt more real than any past Edward could remember. Sometimes other figures appeared, Lucy's children, grown up now, bringing their own children to visit their grandfather. Generations of family that had never existed, would never exist, but did exist here in this house where time had stopped and possibility became reality. Edward aged or didn't age, he couldn't tell which. His reflection had abandoned him entirely, and he'd stopped caring what he looked like. Appearance was for the living world, and he'd left that behind. Margaret came one final time, bringing with her a man Edward didn't recognize, someone official-looking with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "Edward," the man said, "my name is Dr. Patterson. Your sister is worried about you. We'd like to help." They stood in his hallway like ghosts, barely visible, their voices echoing as if they were speaking from the bottom of a well. Behind them, Edward could see Lucy peeking around the corner, her hand over her mouth to stifle giggles. "I don't need help," Edward said politely. "I have everything I need here." Margaret was crying again, her tears like rain on a window. "Eddie, look around. Really look. The house is falling apart. You're falling apart. Lucy is gone. She's been gone for 3 years." But when Edward looked around, he saw home. He saw family photographs lining the walls, saw Lucy's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, saw Sarah's books arranged neatly on the shelves. He saw life, abundant and warm and real. "Would you like some tea?" he offered. Sarah just put the kettle on. The two visitors exchanged glances, filled with meanings Edward couldn't decode. "There's no one here but you, Eddie," Margaret whispered. "There's no tea. There's no Sarah. There's no Lucy. It's just you and—" She gestured helplessly at the air, "and whatever you think you see." But Edward could hear the kettle whistling in the kitchen, could smell the biscuits Sarah was baking, could hear Lucy's laughter drifting down from upstairs. How could Margaret not hear it too? How could she stand in a house so full of life and claim it was empty? "I think you should go," he said gently. "You're upsetting Lucy." They left, but not before Margaret pressed something into his hand, a business card for a hospital, a phone number written in desperate handwriting. Edward threw it away without reading it. Lucy was calling for him to come upstairs, and he didn't want to keep her waiting. Not again. Never again. Years later, or perhaps days, time having become meaningless, Edward Marlowe sits in his daughter's room, reading aloud from a book whose pages never end. Lucy curls against his side, warm and real and 8 years old forever. Sarah hums from the corner, mending clothes that are always somehow torn. The house exists in perfect suspension, a snow globe world where nothing changes and no one leaves. Outside, seasons may pass, governments may fall, the world may end or begin again, but inside, it is always the moment just before happiness is lost, the breath held before the blow falls, the second before everything goes wrong. On the floor, scattered fragments of an hourglass catchlight that comes from nowhere and everywhere. The sand has long since settled into the carpet, marking time that no longer needs to be measured. In the hallway, a mirror reflects nothing at all. And in the kitchen, a kettle that no one put on whistles eternally, calling no one to tea that will never be served. In a house where the dead have forgotten they are dead and the living have forgotten how to live. The rules lie forgotten on a nightstand, their yellowed paper crumbling to dust. But it doesn't matter now. The rules were always meant to be broken, the boundaries meant to be crossed. After all, what parent wouldn't break every law of nature, every rule of reality, for just one more hour with their child? Just one more hour. Forever. When Margaret visits the house one last time, she finds it exactly as she expected, dusty, empty, filled with the particular silence of abandonment. Edward is gone. Whether dead or simply vanished, she'll never know. The furniture is covered with sheets, the rooms filled with cobwebs and memories. But in Lucy's room she finds something strange, a child's drawing, still wet with crayon, showing 3 figures holding hands in front of a house. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, are the words, "My Family," by Lucy Marlowe, age 8. The date on the drawing is yesterday. Margaret takes the drawing with her when she leaves, but by the time she reaches her car, the paper has crumbled to dust in her hands. She tells herself it was old, just old paper, finally succumbing to time. She tells herself a lot of things as she drives away from Bramwell Street, trying not to look in her rearview mirror at the house where, for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a little girl waving from an upstairs window. But houses where children have died are often full of tricks of light and shadow. At least that's what she tells herself. That's what she has to tell herself. Because the alternative, that love really can conquer death, that grief really can reshape reality, that somewhere in a house that exists between moments, her brother and his family really are having tea together in a kitchen where time stands still. The alternative is too beautiful and too terrible to believe. So she doesn't. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, she thinks she can hear a child's laughter carried on the air, and for just a moment, she wonders if the rules of the living world are as absolute as she's always believed. Then morning comes, and the feeling passes, and Margaret gets on with the business of being alive in a world where the dead stay dead, and dolls are just dolls and hourglasses measure time that moves in only one direction. Most of the time. The end.